I'd scored 693 goals, the eighth most of all time, and assisted on 1,193 others, which is the third best. I'd played on 15 All-Star teams and was the league MVP twice. As proud as I was of the awards and honours, I was most satisfied by the unrelenting hard work that had produced it all over 25 years. But there was something else that made my career even more atypical. Since its founding in 1917, thousands of players had skated in pursuit of NHL's ultimate prize, winning the league championship and having their names inscribed on the Lord Stanley's Cup. I'd been part of teams that had accomplished this incredible feat 6 times, and in almost a century, only 9 names were engraved more times on the game's holy chalice than mine. That, to me, was what it was all about. We're in this business to win, and I had always felt like the most important job I had was to make whatever organization I was part of successful, being part of the formula, and, if I was in a position to influence others, making sure I did so effectively. I live by a very simple ethic. Winning isn't an accident, it's a strategy, and you get out what you put in. And this is an excerpt from the book we're going to talk about today, No One Wins Alone by Mark Messier and Jimmy Roberts.
Welcome to Performers, the podcast that takes you into the minds of the world's most extraordinary athletes, coaches, and performers. We're your hosts. I'm Dr. Greg Young, and you've just heard from Dr. Duncan Simpson. As sports psychology experts, we'll guide you through the pages of their autobiographies, revealing the mindsets, strategies, and habits that propelled the world's best to the pinnacle of their fields. Each episode represents over 20 hours of our expert analysis, condensing entire autobiographies into concentrated insights. You gain not only the collective wisdom of these elite performers, but also access to over 30 years of our professional expertise in sports psychology. Listening to this, you're saving countless hours while accessing the distilled wisdom and proven strategies of the best in their fields. On Performers, we help you connect their life-changing lessons with your personal and professional goals, offering you an accelerated path to personal excellence. Duncan, what are our listeners going to get out of this episode?
Today, you'll discover how to apply Mark Messier's strategy for relentless hard work and commitment to your own pursuits, learning that winning is a deliberate process requiring both dedication and effective leadership. You're going to gain practical insights into creating a strong and cohesive team culture and learn how to harness the power of diversity, mutual respect, and understanding personalities to drive collective success. And lastly, you'll learn actionable leadership techniques from Mark Messier, including how to lead by example, set high standards, and inspire your team with a shared purpose. Apply these lessons to cultivate excellence and resilience in your personal and professional life. So, Greg, you heard at the beginning that Mark Messier is one of the all-time hockey greats. He won 6 Stanley Cups with 2 different teams, the Edmonton Oilers and the New York Rangers. His 1,887 points in the regular season are third all-time behind Jaromir Jagr and Wayne Gretzky, of course. His 1,756 regular season NHL games is the third most played all-time. In 2006, the NHL created the Mark Messier Leadership Award to recognize an individual who was a superior leader within their sport and also a contributing member of society. He was also inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame in 2007 in his first year of eligibility. Greg, we couldn't have timed this episode better as both the Oilers and Rangers are currently in their conference finals respectively. And there's one more thing before we get started. I want to shout out our good friend and listener to the show, Jeff McClellan. Jeff's a Canadian and huge hockey fan. Both his boys are elite hockey players too. And when I mentioned this episode, he sent me a picture showing that his son's playing the Mark Messier Arena in St. Albert, which is just outside of Edmonton. So really nice connection there.
That's very cool.
Playing hockey started for me the way I'm guessing it does for most Canadian kids. Before I'd completely figured out walking, my dad strapped a pair of blades on my feet. At first, it was nothing but fun, gliding over ice and trying to stay upright. As I got older and took more interest in the game, I discovered my first hockey hero, Bobby Orr. In my neighborhood, my friends and I were riveted by the way the charismatic Bruins defenseman played the game. He was like no one else. We wanted to be like him. But more than anything, I learned very early that playing was more fun if you were doing it successfully and sharing the effort with other people. Success ultimately meant getting behind my teammates or out in front of them, finding a way to unlock their potential, nudge them, push them, support them, lead them. So, Greg, we're hearing early on some early tenets of modeling when we're talking about Bobby Orr. So he has this kind of role figure he's looking up to, and also this eagerness to lead others.
I feel like this is a way that a lot of youth players start by really grabbing a hold of who their heroes are, whether that's a team or whether that's individuals. I know I certainly had my heroes growing up and really wanting to be a footballer. So this is no real surprise to me here. But I think what is quite surprising is the leadership part of things. It sounds like this is starting really early for him. And we always have that argument, are leaders born or made? Well, maybe we've got some early tenets of that going on here.
And he goes on to say, to understand me, you have to know that hockey is not the most important thing in my life. Family is. In some ways, for me, hockey is simply an extension of family. I mean that literally. I'm like a lot of people. I grew up wanting to be like my dad. And although he earned a living most of my childhood as a teacher, my earliest memory of him is as a professional hockey player. When I first put on skates at the age of 3, our family lived in Portland, Oregon, and Dad was playing for the Portland Buckaroos, one of the 6 teams in the Western Hockey League. He was a hockey lifer. He would go anywhere to play, and he often did. He was chasing a dream. He was a tough guy on every one of his teams. In an era of physical hockey, he was not the type of player you turned your back on. As my brother Paul likes to say, he played for keeps. He was exactly what you might expect, and also exactly what you wouldn't. At home, he was an attentive father and a patient teacher, and to say he was a supportive husband is an understatement. As much as Doug lived for hockey, he always put family first, and he had interests in life that went beyond the sport. After he retired from hockey, he got a master's degree in education and taught kids with special needs. So, Greg, he's got an older brother that plays hockey. His dad is a hockey pro, then becomes a teacher, is a very attentive and patient father. Doesn't this just seem like an ideal recipe for success?
It does sound pretty ideal, to be honest. I also want to give a shout out to the Portland Buckaroos for one of the greatest names in all of sport. I'd never heard of them before. But you're right, this does sound like a really good recipe for success. It provides the opportunity for him to essentially learn by proxy for those people that are doing it before him. So his dad, who's obviously in the sport, and his brother, who's in the sport, what makes them successful? What maybe goes wrong for them in tough times, and how do they deal with that? So it's not just the education that his dad will give him as a teacher, but also the education that he gets as just being around people that are within the sport.
He goes on to say, Mum grew up in Edmonton. She had a pretty good life there, but was no stranger to hardship. She lost her father when she was 8, and an uncle had died in World War II. Doug never really lectured me about hard work, and he didn't have to. Growing up and listening to his stories of those times, I understood viscerally about the cost of getting to where you wanted to go and never complaining what it took to get there. It was hard to make excuses about not having enough time to get things done to a man whose days seemed to be 25 hours long. There's no question the sacrifices they both made were massive. It came down to their commitment to make it work and the love and respect they had for each other. This concept of hard work, Greg, this is woven into the fabric of the Messier family. He talks about hard work throughout the book. And it's something that he says hard work didn't have to be taught.
It seems like, again, it's a family value. It's something that's really important to the family and woven, as you said, into the fabric of the family. And whether they explicitly teach it in the sense that sit down, this is exactly what we do, we work hard and we commit, all that, that's one thing. But I think being in an environment like this, we implicitly take information from that environment. And I think he might be implicitly learning this stuff here, whether he's aware of it or not, conscious of it or not, he's taking this information in like a sponge. And it sounds like it's going to land him in good stead.
And we're going to hear a little bit more about his other family dynamics. He said, those Portland years were where the bond was formed in my original team, my siblings, the 4 of us, my brother, Paul, my older sister, Jenny, me, and my younger sister, Mary Kay. Are separated by little more than 5 years. We did everything together, and we were always outside. Long before I skated around with the Stanley Cup, I learned valuable lessons about getting along with others. In a family, Like any team, there are always going to be different personality types. Not everyone looks at a piece of art and has the same response. Not everyone hears the same message in a speech. Each person is a unique combination of their genetic wiring and life experiences. As a leader, you learn to accept and appreciate that each one of your teammates might react differently to the same situation. With that knowledge, you can resolve any conflicts that arise from a place of understanding. So he's learning these elements of teamwork, communication. He's starting to understand diversity of opinion and personality and this appreciation for individual differences. So coupled with that skating time where he's pushing his friend and leading, he's learning these other lessons of leadership.
This is a crash course in group dynamics that he's getting at home. And when we talk about implicit learning, this is it at its finest. And when you're talking about understanding and having an appreciation for other people's opinions and perspectives, if you truly want to know your own perspective, it's a really good idea to understand the perspectives of others, and that's going to strengthen the understanding of your own perspective.
So Dad thought very carefully about the way I developed. Although he steered me towards hockey from a young age, he also made sure my life was filled with all sorts of experiences, each with its own lessons to teach. Growing up, I didn't only play hockey. I played soccer, baseball, lacrosse, and a lot of the time I just played outside, the more structured, organized sports. The balance in my life made me love hockey even more. When the season came, it was time to play the game. I would be ready to go and run towards it. So, Greg, we've heard a lot about sports specialization in recent years, and I think it's got a bad rap.
We've heard this in many episodes, and while sampling is a crucial part of sport performance growing up, it is essentially a funnel into specialization.
So for context listeners, Doug is his dad. If that was a little bit confusing, I apologize. And he goes on and says, when Doug retired from his professional playing career in 1969 to take a job teaching junior high in Edmonton, it was a big change for our family. The move to Edmonton was also a turning point in my relationship with hockey. Just as Doug seemed to be stepping away from playing, I started to take it more seriously. In Portland, hockey wasn't a sport that many people cared about, and I was interested mostly because of my dad. But in Canada, it wasn't an oddity. It was religion. This was the land of outdoor rinks and entire communities organized around the game. Kids skated after school on lakes. So Greg, for me, there's something about timing here. His dad has retired, which means for me, he can probably give more time to his kids and simultaneously they're moving to a hotbed of hockey, where, as he says, there's access to facilities and sheets of ice, which can only serve to enhance his development.
Again, we've seen a relocation to a place where access is far more readily available for this chosen sport. And we've seen this with a couple of different performers throughout the episodes. And I think one thing that stands out to me too is also this idea of entire communities being organized around the game. For me, that really connects with what Dan Carter was experiencing in the rugby communities within New Zealand.
As a 7-year-old, I joined Paul on a team in the Pee Wee division. Pee Wees are supposed to be 11 and 12 years old. Physically, I probably wasn't ready, but the choice was a necessity for our family, and one that would set the course of my journey through sport. With all my dad had going on, there wasn't time for him to coach both me and Paul on different teams, or even if he wasn't coaching, to take us to separate games and practices. Playing up above your age, size, or skill level can be challenging. If you're always playing against competition that is bigger, stronger, and faster, it's hard to get involved in the game. That's no fun. It can kill your confidence and squash your potential. And if you don't have the strength to compete against older kids, there's even a risk of getting injured. But if managed properly, the benefits of playing up can be tremendous. I was practicing twice a week with kids whose skills were certainly more developed and who were probably skating slower on line rushes just so I could keep up. But at the same time, they were not so far advanced that I couldn't keep up. Since I couldn't rely on size, strength, or speed, I was forced to bust my ass and pay attention to the fundamentals of shooting, passing, stick handling, and skating, building up those skills to match the level of play of the older kids around me. Growing up with Paul, I was used to playing with someone bigger and stronger than me, and I didn't worry about it. I was happy to play with him on a team. I was never scared, and I slowly started to make real progress. I think Mark does a really nice job here of outlining both the positives and the potential drawbacks of playing upper level Is there anything from your own experience, Greg, of playing up an age group?
Yeah, I think something to think about before I give you an example is the notion of early and late maturation within sports. So kids of all ages are going to mature physically at different rates. That's just the nature of the beast, unfortunately. And I think it's really important, and this is for anyone that's coaching youth athletes that maybe are late mature, we may even call them late bloomers, where they're physically maybe a little undersized, perhaps a little bit slower, not physically as strong or as fast, just like Messier was explaining here. Is when you're working with these athletes, is try and continue to encourage them to develop other parts of their game. Maybe that's their technical ability. He talks about stick handling and what he calls the fundamentals. Maybe it's a little bit more of an understanding of the tactical components of the game as well, whatever that game may be. And what you will find is as those athletes begin to mature and that strength differential and speed differential and size differential, that window starts to close as they catch up to those early maturers, they're going to be in a far better position to continue to go on and succeed. What we tend to see is people that are early maturers rely on those faster, bigger, stronger advantages that they get in early age and sometimes neglect to develop the other skills that Messier puts a real premium on here. And to be perfectly honest with you, Duncan, yes, I did see this growing up. Back before there were academies, there were what we called schools of excellence where I grew up. And the number of players that I saw going from teams that I played on that went to these schools of excellence at a really early age, we're talking 12 and 13, honestly, it tended to be because they were bigger, they were faster, they were stronger. They weren't necessarily better players than anyone else, but they were far more effective at that age level. And what I saw was as everyone started to catch them up, you'd see them coming back out of the school of excellence or the academy system and back into kind of local club football at 16, 17, when everyone else had caught up to them and they couldn't just rely on that single lever that they'd been successful with.
Yeah, and that's an excellent breakdown. And he goes on and he talks a little more about these stages of development. And he says, after graduating from Pee Wee hockey the next year, I kind of treaded water when it came to my development. I wasn't playing at the level that I expected of myself, but wasn't too discouraged either. I still loved just playing. I worked my way through bantam and then midget hockey and then approached the age of 15. I wasn't in the same place as Paul had been at that stage, physically or in terms of talent. That summer, after I turned 15, though, things started to change for me. I had a growth spurt and I started lifting weights. Most crucially, I made big improvements to my skating. I started training with a former figure skater named Audrey Bakewell, who was teaching classes in power skating. She wanted to change everything about my form. So he was a late bloomer, and we're also hearing kind of an innovative approach. He's learning from a figure skater instead of other ice hockey players. And remember back in episode 8 with Kobe Bryant, he took tap dancing lessons to strengthen his ankles.
What we see here is a technique that I once learned from the kind of the corporate world, and it's a problem-solving technique called the related worlds technique. And really that's looking at some industry or some group or some individual that has something figured out that you want to get better at. And then basically going and finding out from them, how did they get better? So he wants to get better at skating in his hockey game. Who's very, very good at skating? Well, we can definitely say that figure skaters are. So going to see Audrey Bakewell and learning how to quote unquote power skate is taking something from another world, although it's very closely related, and applying it to his world, relating it to his world in the world of hockey.
Yeah, and we talked about that concept of cross-pollination of ideas, I think back in episode 10 with Pele. And that's just, I've never heard of the related worlds problem-solving technique. Well, that's something for the listeners.
Every day is a school day.
So in the fall of 1978, he's 17 years of age and he's leaning towards going to play college hockey like his brother Paul was. But then he saw an opportunity to go pro with the WHA, which was the World Hockey Association, which was a competitor to the NHL in the 1970s. So he starts off with a team called the Indianapolis Racers and then goes to the Cincinnati Stingers. Amazing names again.
Great names, great names.
So a little bit about his time with the Stingers. He says, the Stingers decided to keep me on the team, and I played out my first full season of professional WHA hockey with them. But it was apparent that whatever talent I had could only be described, or charitably so, as raw. Physically, I felt comfortable. I tagged along with Paul my whole life, so playing with and against older and more experienced guys wasn't an issue. In terms of skill, though, I had a long way to go. I was an unfinished product. People say I'm crazy when I mention this, but I've always looked at myself as a late bloomer. Even though I turned pro at an early age, I was nowhere near a finished product physically or in terms of my skills, but I was lucky. I could have gotten into an organization that didn't have the patience to let a younger player mature or couldn't afford a mistake. Often organizations get clouded with the need for immediate success, so they cut short the process. In that scenario, they might have looked at me differently and not given me an opportunity. So Messier here highlights what I'd say is the role of luck. He landed in an organization that was determined to give him an opportunity to develop and gave him a chance, even though it's still pro hockey.
I think this is when professional sports organizations get talent identification right. It's very rare you're going to find the finished article. That's not the point of these things. It's about identifying who has the potential and then using all of your skill and all of your expertise to help that person develop into the player that, and indeed the person that you think they are going to potentially be. To give him some credit, though, open doors still need to be walked through. So just because they opened the door and give him a chance didn't mean that that was job done for sure.
And he goes on to talk a little bit more about that. It's a lovely lead in. He says, when you're young, as an athlete or in any other career, you're really at the mercy of people around you, whether it's a coach, an owner, your peers, or your boss. But skill development wasn't the only area where I needed work. There was the issue of maturity as well. What I failed to grasp at 17 is that as much as it's just hockey, at the professional level, there's a lot at stake. There are livelihoods and families, a whole other level of responsibility. You're part of an organism, and in order for an organism to thrive, each and every person needs to do their part. The organization needs to be able to count on you. Of course, the real lesson is there are actions and there are consequences. If you're not going to change your actions, you're going to suffer consequences. I wish I could say it sank in immediately that I changed completely before I went to the NHL, but that wasn't the case. So Greg, he's alluding to he was a little bit of a hellraiser in his teens, and he continued that early in his professional hockey career. But we've talked about the importance of gatekeepers in episode 12 with Jackie Robinson. Of course, the context with Jackie Robinson was completely different, and it was around the racial barrier. But we're hearing from Mark that he's at the mercy of others. And one thing that he's learning is what it means to be a pro.
The reality of pro sport is that if you don't contribute to performance or the greater good of the team, you'll be replaced by someone that does. The most dangerous mindset in pro sport is complacency and thinking that you're irreplaceable. So for those of you that work in a sort of a regular workplace that you think you're incredibly valuable to the day-to-day operations and success of your organization, next time you take an extended break or a vacation, when you return, I want you to notice how the place didn't crumble around you. And I know you and I have experienced this as well, Duncan, in our places of work. Unfortunately, you're not as vitally important as you think you are. Now, this can be a cautionary thought, or it can actually be a relatively freeing thought, knowing that you have people around you who can perform at a high level and either provide you support when you're there or provide you with skills when you're absent. Now, a moral of the story from our most recent episode with Bill Walsh is that maybe he overestimated his importance and wasn't able to relinquish some of his control, which I think was to his ultimate detriment, Duncan.
As it turned out, his year with the Stingers ended up being the WHA's final season. The league was struggling, and ultimately it was going to fall. So he only got 1 year with the Stingers, and he says, for my 5 months with the Stingers, I made $35,000. I felt rich. I'd completed a season of pro hockey. I loved the traveling, and I knew there was no other kind of life I wanted to live. It was also a time to get myself in physical and mental shape to play in the NHL. I worked out like a madman. So at the same time, Greg, the NHL is growing. And again, I think there's a sliding doors. There's a little bit of luck going on. And he says, a deal was struck on June 22nd, and the Oilers, along with the Quebec Nordiques, the Winnipeg Jets, and the Hartford Whalers joined the NHL. This was beyond big, something that very few people in Edmonton ever thought was possible. So after a year with the Stingers, there's a draft for the NHL. And he says, a little while later, someone, I don't even remember who, came out and said I'd been drafted by the Oilers in the 3rd round with the 48th pick overall. Despite being a lower pick than I'd hoped for, I'd been selected by my hometown team. I was about to get a chance to be part of the biggest thing that had ever happened in my town. In short, Glenn, who was the coach, was banking on positive talk, gut feeling, my family hockey background, and what he saw watching me in practice and play just a few games, more than any kind of hard evidence that I'd be able to make something of myself as an NHL player. Everyone cared about the other 18-year-old on the team, Wayne Gretzky. Then again, Wayne was just different and always had been. By this time, there was no comparing myself with Wayne. The previous year, where I'd scored 1 goal for Cincinnati, he'd had 104 points, scoring 43 goals and 61 assists for the Oilers in 72 games after being traded from the Indianapolis Racers. So he's been picked, Greg, by his hometown team, but he's also under less scrutiny because he's got a new teammate, someone called Wayne Gretzky, which perhaps provides him with a bit of air cover as he beds in and develops.
Why the hell are we talking about Mark Messier? Why did we choose this book and not the great one? No, in all seriousness, it couldn't be a more perfect place for him to be. And if he can't play with Gretzky and show the kind of caliber player he is, who can he play with?
So he goes into camp, and after a successful camp, he says, I slid comfortably into the rhythm of the NHL. I knew what a life in hockey felt like, but the first thing I learned was how much I had to learn. Normally, you look to the older guys for an education. I was seeing hockey as a whole new game by closely watching the youngest guy in the league. So, Greg, we've got a little bit about Gretzky here, and I think when you have someone who's played with one of the all-time greats, if not the all-time great, then you need to dive in a little bit. So what did he see in Gretzky? And he says, nobody had ever seen anything like Wayne Gretzky before. Coming into this year, everyone knew he was skilled, but a lot of people were curious to see how he would stack up against NHL talent. Gordie Howe did it with strength and brawn. Bobby Orr did it with sheer skating speed and dynamic movement. Nobody had ever done it with cerebral finesse and guile like Wayne. I watched him like a hawk, and what I saw was kind of odd. Wayne saw the ice in 4D, where people were and where they were going. I think of that famous quote of his, I don't skate to where the puck is, I skate to where it's going to be. The perception when Wayne came into league was that he wasn't a great skater, but that wasn't the truth. He was an amazing skater. His edge work and the way he changed direction. People said he wasn't fast, but he never lost a race to the puck. Nobody could ever catch him, and nobody could ever hit him. He was like Houdini. I heard people say that he didn't have a great shot, but you look at the score sheet and he'd have 2 goals and 4 assists, and you'd be scratching your head wondering, did I miss something here? It was difficult to play against him because he didn't resist. He was like a guy practicing Tai Chi who fights by diffusing his adversary's energy. It was remarkable to watch. Even as a teammate, you had to make sure you didn't get caught flat-footed just admiring what he was doing. It was too easy to get mesmerized. He was a different kind of player. His trajectory was like a rocket ship, and it was a good idea for anybody who was going to skate on his team to strap on and find a way to complement him. We all recognized he was a special talent, and his play elevated everyone's game. You'd see what he did on the ice, and realizing it's possible, try to do it as well. His enthusiasm and joy for the game and his competition level were contagious. I was learning from Wayne on the ice, but I realized nearly too late there were things I needed to learn off the ice. So, Greg, if you're willing to learn, it seems like being Wayne Gretzky's teammate was like getting a masterclass in hockey every single day. Messier obviously takes the positive here, but I could easily see how you could start engaging in that peer comparison, and that would be actually very detrimental to your own confidence if you start comparing yourself to the all-time great. I mean, we're talking about the GOAT of hockey here. Some say he's actually the greatest athlete of all time when it comes to records and statistics, but it seems like Messier recognized that he was in this presence of greatness. He says he was a different kind of player, and his trajectory was like a rocket ship. And it was a good idea for anybody who was going to skate on his team to strap on and find a way to complement him. I love that idea.
They say the game recognizes game, and I think that's exactly what he's laid out here. I actually think it's interesting because I love the idea of bringing up that peer comparison. It would be very easy to be like, okay, well, I've got to be like him, or I've got to do things as well as him. I think realizing, no, you already have Wayne Gretzky. Being able to, he uses the word compliment quite a lot, right? To be able to complement someone else's skill set and recognize what your role is here. Everyone probably wants to be number one and wants to be the alpha, but there's nothing wrong with being number two. Every number one needs a consigliere. It's part and parcel of things. So I think if you recognize that special talent and that you're in the presence of greatness, hitch your wagon to that and do whatever you can to serve that greatness, because collectively you're going to win. Gretzky doesn't win games by himself. He wins as part of the collective, and to be part of that is just as important.
So in their first season in the NHL, the Oilers make it to the playoffs, but they're swept in the opening round by Philadelphia Flyers. So in the offseason, Mark and his brother love to travel. And in 1981, there's a kind of wild story when they went to Barbados and they sampled magic mushrooms. So there's a little paragraph here I'd like your take on, Greg. First time, and maybe the last time we'll talk about magic mushrooms on this episode. Or maybe the last time we'll talk about magic mushrooms at all. So when the mushrooms wore off and after we got some sleep, we had a chance to decompress and look back. There was a profound sense of what the hell just happened. How is what happened even possible? The only answer I could find was that our minds are capable of so much more than we understand. And that realization changed me. But what taking them did for me at the age of 19 was profound. I was electrified with the appreciation of how vast the mind is, and that there is so much we don't know. The result was a deep and lasting appreciation for the diversity of human beings. People cannot only act in different ways, it struck me, but they can think in ways that I'd never imagined. From them, I realized that intolerance is often due to a person not being able to recognize and respect this fact. Just because I wasn't familiar with someone else's perspective didn't make them wrong. Never again would I believe that someone was fundamentally mistaken because their mind worked in a way I was unfamiliar with. I saw that they could just be exploring different parts of the same human landscape of possibility. So this singular experience, Greg, really seemed to have a profound impact on his outlook on life. We're not necessarily advocating for listeners to go and eat mushrooms, though.
I think there are certain states that are legalizing mushrooms. So if you're in a state and you're so inclined, well, that's your choice to do so. But to be perfectly honest, we know a minute amount about how the brain actually works. And from my understanding, this is going to likely be the new frontier of neuropsychology as pharmacological agents become more readily and, as I said, legally available. So it's actually quite an exciting time in this part of the research world. And who knows what we'll discover. I say we, I'm not doing any of this research.
Maybe some sampling.
Whoa, easy, Tiger. Don't throw accusations at me.
So you play hockey with your mind, your body, and your spirit. The mind is a powerful thing, and it can either help you or hurt you. Talent can take you far, but ultimately what separates you is how mentally strong you are. I started to wonder how I could train my mind to make my body do something extraordinary. At the time in the NHL, 99% of training was physical. Over my career, I became increasingly interested in sports psychology and breathing techniques. I wanted to marry the physical with the mental, not just to improve my game, but also my life. I learned that the mind is a muscle and that you have to train it, like you do all other muscles, in the pursuit of excellence. All I can say is, preach, Mark, preach.
If we can get that made on a really big billboard sign and have that put up somewhere where all athletes can see it, that would be fantastic. I love it.
And he says, after Barbados, I couldn't wait to get back to hockey. When training camp rolled around in 1981, I was a 20-year-old, but entering my third calendar year in the NHL already, and my fourth year as a pro. I'd had a pretty good season in 1980-81, scoring 23 goals and adding 40 assists. I was settling into the lifestyle of being a professional hockey player. The basics of it, the way of life, the travel, the time management skills, the game preparation, the efficiency of practice, all were coming together. With my increasing confidence, I was able to put attention into improving some of the finer details of my game, including the equipment I was using. I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what kind of stick worked best, what kind of lie, what kind of curve. Paul Coffey and I got deeply interested in improving the dynamics of our skates. Greg, once we get the performance rocks in place, then we can start to work around the edges a little bit and start focusing on those details. But we've got to have those big rocks in place, as we've discussed in previous episodes.
The big rocks are vital. For me, mind, sleep, nutrition, recovery. Those are my big four. If you're not nailing those, the finer details, they're inconsequential.
As we went through training camp and started the season, we bought into all for one, team first mentality. It paid off. We took off on a hot streak and never looked back. We won 19 more games than we had the year before and ended up with 37 more points. Our team scored 417 goals. No franchise had ever previously broken 400. Everyone knew their role and everyone was happy. There were no cliques. We were one. The irony of figuring out how to play together as a team was that in doing so, many of us racked up huge individual numbers. Our dressing room was one that prided itself on diversity. Letting people be themselves was a big part of the dynamics in our building. We wanted a room that was rich with culture, music, and ideas. There's an easy lesson here. You want to make someone productive? Make them feel comfortable first. I think we've heard the phrase before, being an elite teammate. And part of this is allowing for and making space, Greg, for people to bring their whole selves into that locker room. This is about, for me, creating a sense of belonging and that everyone is seen and valued, isn't it?
Belonging is the right word for me here. Having an understanding of what in-group and out-group behaviors are and how to create belonging cues within your group is really important. So allowing people to bring their full and authentic self to each situation and knowing what is acceptable within the group and what isn't acceptable within the group and really fostering that sense of community within your building, or as he says, within your dressing room, that sets teams up for long-term success.
And he says, I was super raw when I turned pro, but by this time I developed physically into a bigger and stronger forward. I was also getting to know the league better, figuring out how to play against different goalies and where to position myself to be more offensive player, and my skills were sharpening. Every day at practice was a learning experience as I'd watched the incredible talent on display from my teammates. You can't hurry experience, but by my third full year, I was feeling more confident. I love that. You can't hurry experience. That is a great line.
I think you can make sure that people are exposed to the right kinds of experiences, though, and know that they are looking at something noteworthy. The fact that he makes a comment on the incredible talent on display from his teammates suggests that he's aware that he is getting the right type of experience. So you're quite right. You can't hurry experience itself, but you can expedite that process, I think, by making sure that people are exposed to the right experiences.
So as Messier just said, the Oilers are on a really hot streak and they go into the playoffs and they're playing the LA Kings. And I'm going to read a little bit because I think there's an important lesson to take here. What came to be known as the Miracle on Manchester was complete. It was the biggest comeback in NHL history. From 5-0 down, the Kings come back and win 6-5 in overtime. We won the next day to even the series, but lost Game 5 the next night in Edmonton, and with it the series. It was a massive disappointment, and that Game 3 was, to this day, the most shocking loss I'd ever been part of. Over the off-season months, we regrouped, took stock, and earnestly set about learning the two most critical lessons. Lesson 1, the most obvious one, never disrespect an opponent. Doing so calls their character into question, which only increases their motivation. It doesn't matter if you're playing the lowest seeded playoff team. These are pros. They fought their way to that spot, and there's a reason that they got there. They rose to the occasion. Lesson 2, the most important one, we didn't execute. We underperformed. Period. I wanted to highlight this section, Greg, because I think there's a life lesson for all listeners here. There are zero benefits to underestimating an opponent or anybody for that matter. And I love this line. It's kind of assume you're playing a great player until they prove otherwise. Never underestimate anybody. There are zero benefits to underestimating people.
There are some cautionary tales from previous episodes. I can think of Andre Agassi doing this. I can think of Mike Tyson doing this. I can think of obviously Mark Messier doing this. So there is some precedent here, and not once have they come back and said, I underestimated him, and you know what? It worked well.
So we're going to jump ahead to the 1983 season, and it's Mark Messier's first Stanley Cup appearance, and they're playing the New York Islanders. We were on the doorstep of the Holy Land. Waiting for us there were just who we expected, the New York Islanders. You might say that there are 4 seasons in the NHL. The exhibition or preseason, the regular season, the playoffs, and then the Stanley Cup finals. We'd seen how the intensity, the anxiety, the level of play, the competitiveness ratcheted up for each one, but this last season, the Cup finals was brand new to us. It wasn't new to the Islanders. They had figured out how to consistently navigate all four in a way few before them ever had. They were coming off their third Stanley Cup in a row. They were only the fifth team ever to do that, dating all the way back to 1927. Winning it all is hard. Repeating is harder. So the first game of the Stanley Cup, they're at home, and he says, the first finals game was at home, and everything about it was electric. My whole life had pointed to this moment. My dad had been a professional hockey player before me, and now the highest level of competition had finally come to my hometown, and I was in the middle of it. I remember standing on the blue line for the anthem and being beyond excited. Here I was, living a dream. I was in the starting lineup for the Stanley Cup finals. When I got out on the ice, I lasted something like 15 seconds before my vision got blurry and I started seeing spots. I'd never experienced anything like that before. Have you ever been so amped up that you couldn't see straight? I had to go back to the dressing room for a moment to try to get hold of myself. I had a little water and regrouped, but it wasn't the last of my problems that night, or the team's. So Greg, he's so overwhelmed here.
Being able to recognize, hey, I'm not where I need to be for my performance right now. I need to do something, whatever that thing is, to get me into my desired, we'll call it performance state. I think that is a great part of self-awareness that leads to self-regulation, however you get to that self-regulation piece.
So probably not unsurprisingly, a team that's never been to the Stanley Cup finals, playing a team that has going for the 4P, and he says, we were impatient. And instead of waiting for opportunities, the Islanders were the perfect counterpunchers. They had talent, brains, system, and the experience to take advantage of our mistakes. It was a 2-0 loss, but in short, they just dismantled us. The Islanders simply had more experience and guile to handle this big occasion, Greg, and the Islanders go on and win the next 3 games to sweep the series 4-0. But this is a really important kind of learning moment for Mark and his teammates. And he says, when we left Nassau Coliseum after being swept, we walked past their dressing room expecting to see a big celebration. Instead, we just saw a bunch of guys with ice bags strapped all over their bodies, drinking beer like they were sitting around a campfire. I think 4 cups in 4 years took its toll. They were beaten up, but the lesson was clear. There's a huge price to be paid in order to win. I don't think we left that series having paid the same price they did. Until that moment, I'm not even sure we knew what it meant to pay that kind of price. We tried to understand what they'd shown us. They were like a tank. They kept moving forward, no matter what was in front of them. As far along as we thought we were going into that series, we realized after it, walking past them wearing their ice packs, what the difference was between being champions and being runners-up. Greg, I love this. Lessons can come from absolutely anywhere. And he has this realization of what champions actually look like. And I think this is just a great lesson.
As we preach at the end of every episode of Performers, success leaves clues. And it's up to people to be able to mine those clues and find them and hopefully go forward and apply those clues.
So after they get swept, we couldn't wait to get back together for training camp in the late summer of 1983. We were still kids and impatient to get the season underway, make use of the lessons we'd learned, and finally bring home the cup. On the morning of October 4th, one day before the start of our season, we found out that our captain, Lee Fogelin, had come up with a plan to help us get there. But when the media left the locker room on October morning in 1983, Lee announced that he was giving his captaincy up and granting it to Wayne Gretzky. He did it with selflessness and grace. We didn't know this was about to happen, but the truth was, it was Wayne's team already. He had been named the league's MVP in every one of his first 4 seasons. Though he was still only 22 years old, he went about his business with focus and seriousness that belied his age. Players both older and younger than him looked up to Wayne, recognized his greatness, and took what he said to heart. So Lee, at 28 years old, realized the best thing for our team was to codify the reality that already existed and voluntarily give up his captaincy to Wayne. Greg, Messier is getting So many valuable lessons about leadership here.
It's interesting because obviously in any autobiography is a reflection upon the time when you've had a little bit of space to think about these things and to digest them and make sense of them. I'm really curious to know if he recognized in this moment what a great lesson in leadership this is. And when you think about Lee Fogelin, the captain at the time, what does a leader do? Well, a leader probably makes sure that the right person is in the position to be able to lead the group or the team or the organization most effectively. And by relinquishing his role as essentially leader in his captaincy, he is doing that. He's no longer in that formal leadership role, but this is definitely a really, really powerful lesson.
It was the perfect example of how effective leadership is the absence of ego, with only one thought in mind, the collective. Lee embodied the selfless nature that's required all the way down the roster. A person can have great pride, but no ego. It only made us look up to Lee even more than we already did. What a leader does is to get the best out of the people he or she leads. And Wayne's way of doing it was to lead by example. He was driven to win. His passion for the game was off the charts. His mental preparation and commitment were beyond imagination. My teammates and I saw that. It made us want to play harder and follow in his example he set. The amount of attention he was paying to his craft was way above what I was doing, and I was already an all-star. It made me think, how am I going to maximize my potential? Watching Wayne go about his business, how he prepared, how he handled the media, how he handled the pressure, and how he worked on days we didn't have a game gave me the answers. There was absolutely nothing casual about the way he approached even the simplest, most mundane tasks. He always conducted them with intention and purpose. To me, it sounds like Messier is continuously kind of recalibrating his mind to what's possible on a daily basis by watching Gretzky. It's like kind of shifting this preconceived notion of what his own abilities are and his own potential just by watching Wayne.
I'd agree with you there. If you're constantly essentially seeing the boundaries of what's possible within your performance environment get pushed further and further, then that's going to give you a sense that you can push those boundaries too and grow and develop as an athlete. And as he says, he's already an all-star, but there's so much room for him to grow here. He's definitely got a great role model in Gretzky.
So, of course, they make it back to the Stanley Cup finals and they face the Islanders again, who are going into their fifth straight finals, which is crazy. On May 18th, up 3-1 in the Stanley Cup finals, we had an off day to sit and think. We had a morning practice, then spent the rest of the day resting and getting good nutrition and hydration. There wasn't much else to do. Every emotion, every image in my mind all day long was about the cup. We needed only one more win to seal the deal, to accomplish the goal for which these guys, who had become my brothers, and I had been fighting so hard for over a 5-year journey. A lifetime dream. I must have played this game 10 times in my head. It was a day filled with giddy anticipation. What will winning the Stanley Cup feel like, I wondered? What will it mean to the fans, to our families, to us? I think it's important to allow yourself to imagine all the positive things about to happen in connection with accomplishing your goals. You can't get carried away, but especially on those days off, give yourself permission to dream a little. It's only human. To deny yourself those moments is unnatural, and it's healthy to imagine it's going the other way too, a crushing defeat so you can face your fear of failure. You can't just dwell on it though. Then you have to compartmentalize and put the thoughts aside so you can be present and execute when you're on the ice. All day, I couldn't wait for the night to come so I could go to sleep and get to that moment, but it was hard to sleep. Greg, this is all about mental preparation and particularly his use of imagery here.
And we have heard this tool of imagery being used across a number of our different performers in previous episodes. And this is what we consider to be motivation general imagery. And that sounds a little bit sort of technical. But what that means is when we say something's motivational, that image is kind of driving your desire to want to achieve something. And when we say general, it's kind of a broad, big picture. It's not me working on a very specific, maybe puck handling technique or something like that I'm going to execute within a game or a specific place I'm going to be on the ice. It's a bit more broad. It's a bit more of a larger, bigger picture. So we combine those two things together. It's the sense of excitement and the drive and the motivation that I get from seeing this big picture. So picturing himself winning the Stanley Cup, what's that going to feel like? What's it going to mean to his friends, to his family? That's what he's using his imagery for here.
So they win the game 5-2, and with it the Stanley Cup, 4-1 overall, beating the Islanders, as I mentioned. And he says, We denied them their fifth consecutive title. I'm sure that was a bitter pill to swallow. Only once before in Stanley Cup history had a team been able to win 5 straight, the mighty Canadiens of the 1950s, but we owed them. If it wasn't for the Islanders pushing us and showing us what kind of sacrifice was necessary to win, I don't think we would ever have become as good as we eventually did. Greg, we've discussed the importance of rivalries in other episodes. I think going back in episode 1, we had Andre Agassi, whose great rival was Pete Sampras. In episode 4 with Dan Carter, it was all about New Zealand and South Africa. Episode 5 and 6 was about the rivalry between Tennessee and Connecticut. And in episode 10, it was about Brazil and Uruguay. And you've mentioned before how rivalries can be this forcing function for us to push our own boundaries and performance.
Yeah, those are all great examples. And I think I might have even used the example of Batman had the Joker, right? Rivalries provide resistance. And if there's no resistance to what you're trying to achieve, then there really is no need for growth or development. So, as you say, it's a forcing function. It makes us have to do those things if we want to achieve what we want to achieve. So, resistance, although in the moment can feel like a pretty bad thing, a tough thing, a negative thing, it's actually hugely important for our development.
We have a nice moment here, and it kind of comes full circle. We started with his family and all about his family and his dad being this lifer, hockey lifer, as it were. And he says, the tradition is that everybody on the team gets the cup for a few days and they can take it wherever they want. We eventually made it back to my parents' house when my parents, siblings, and the whole extended family joined us. It was a trip for my relatives to walk in and see the Stanley Cup in our living room. It just didn't seem real. It was something they would never have thought to imagine. It was just about as conceivable as coming over from church for a cup of coffee and sitting down next to the Pope. It was an especially powerful moment for my parents. Doug had had the same dream as a player, and now he got to see the cup for himself. It was said earlier that hockey is like a religion in Canada, and you just get this sense that it just means so much to his entire family, and especially for his dad, who chased this dream but never quite made it.
I think the parallel that I can draw here is with Pele and his father. I think it was Dondinho was his dad's name, who was a really, really good player, never kind of made it to the heights. And when Pele eventually did win that World Cup and kind of exercise the demons of their rivals, Uruguay, as you said a little earlier, I think you kind of see this come home and similar feelings here. So I see the parallel here too.
So as tough as that first Stanley Cup was, in the 84-85 season, it was kind of a breeze for them. And he says, it would be an insult to the rest of the league to say the season was a breeze, but we were in peak form and we couldn't have played much better. We beat the Flyers in 5 in the final to win the cup for the second straight year. And during this time, he's getting a little bit into Eastern philosophy here, which I think is really interesting. And I want to share this with you. He says, I was pretty open-minded from my travels each summer. I'd become increasingly interested in Eastern philosophy over the previous couple of years. I did things like yoga and acupuncture, which at the time was still relatively exotic. But he also gave me a book that affected me greatly, the Tao Te Ching. I found it so interesting in the simplicity of its teachings, how to live with goodness and integrity in a world that makes it challenging. It made me think about my own actions and how they've been perceived. How can I be more sensitive to others? What kind of energy am I emitting? I was always in search of new ways to grow and improve, both as an athlete and as a person. I figured that these practices had been around for thousands of years and there must be something in them. The understanding in Buddhism and other Eastern religions of the connection between the mind and the body made perfect intuitive sense to me. I'd had the sense at times while playing sports of being filled with a powerful energy, a sense that I could do anything. I felt invincible, like nothing could stop me. I knew that the source of this feeling was ultimately in the mind, but that only made me more in awe of how powerful and mysterious the mind really is. So, Greg, I'm going to stereotype here, but this isn't perhaps what you'd expect to hear from a tough Canadian hockey player, especially someone, 25, 30 years ago, but he's actually very philosophical and very open-minded.
I think that's a wonderful way to put it. And it seems like he's quite an inquisitive guy. He's open for new experiences and seems to have that constant desire to learn. And again, maybe this is a little bit of reflection in an autobiography, maybe from the moment to moment. But what it made me think about was this quotation. And I told you last week that I like philosophy and, reading those leather-bound books. So here's another one for you. And this is from Plutarch. He says, "For the mind does not require filling like a bottle, but rather like wood. It only requires kindling to create an impulse to think independently and an ardent desire for truth." And for me, I think that's kind of what education is in a nutshell. Really good teachers don't just give you information, they give you a desire, a will to learn, a real thirst for knowledge and education. Maybe that's something that he learned from Doug. As a reminder, Doug is his dad, and Doug was a teacher. So maybe this is something that's kind of woven in as part of that sort of implicit learning that we got from maybe the earlier family values that we talked about.
So jumping ahead a little bit, in 1998, they make it back to the Cup final and they sweep the Bruins 4-0. And after the 1998 season, something dramatically changes. When I had first heard the rumors that summer that he might be dealt, I remember I was lying on my bed and thinking, how could this even be possible? He's 27, at the peak of his career and coming off 4 Stanley Cups. It would have been like the Bulls trading Michael Jordan. It was just unthinkable. I didn't believe it could happen. So it truly was a total shock to me when it did. Wayne wanted to see what else was out there. He was the best player in the game and deserved to be paid like it. Ask yourself what you would have done. Chosen a path that was best for you and your family and your career, or chosen one that was best for others? I certainly couldn't blame him for the one he took. Anybody who thought Wayne was selfish just didn't know him. He felt so guilty for leaving and indebted to the team and the city of Edmonton. A trade in his absolute prime. Jim Matheson of the Edmonton Journal once said, it was like selling the Mona Lisa. And we've seen countless examples of superstars who get traded at the end of their career to a big market team to chase one more championship or extend their career. This wasn't any of that. The Kings were getting the biggest superstar in his prime. There had never been a trade like it. The Edmonton Sun columnist Graham Hicks wrote, he was our best reason for living here. That's amazing.
Wow, what a known that is.
I think most people in the town supported Wayne. He was revered. Sometimes when a star player leaves a team, he's vilified. When LeBron James left Cleveland, some fans burned his jersey. But there was hardly any of that. People were sad more than anything. Greg, there's even an ESPN 30 for 30 called The King's Ransom about this trade. That's how big and shocking it was.
I'm going to have to give that one a watch, I think.
The trade was going to have an enormous impact on our professional lives, but mostly we were thinking about our friend, hoping he'd made the right choice. We wanted him to be happy. The reality soon set in though. Wayne had been traded within our division, and that was really going to change the landscape. It would be incredibly hard to play against him, not only physically but emotionally. Instantly, the LA Kings became the team that we were going to have to go through to keep winning. So for those of you that might not fully appreciate the relationship between Gretzky and Messier, there's a little known fact, but Paulina Gretzky, Wayne Gretzky's daughter, who's married to the golfer Dustin Johnson, is Mark Messier's goddaughter. I don't know if you knew that, Greg.
I definitely did not know that.
I was named the new captain, and the void that I had to try and fill was massive. I was lucky though. I wasn't in it alone. Our team culture was well established, and our roster was full of experienced veterans who were not only tremendous hockey players, but knew how to support a captain and help lead the team. I think that speaks volumes about what we had created. You don't have to have a C on your sweater to be a leader. So, going into the postseason in 1989, of course, who did they meet in the first round of the postseason? The LA Kings. That meant the opening series of the postseason was going to be Edmonton and Los Angeles. Who was writing this script? Instead of winning another cup with Wayne, we were going to have to get past him. It felt like I was about to go to war against my brother. In my own stupid way, I made it all about me and Wayne. It consumed me. At some point during the season, I started feeling like I needed some kind of validation for replacing Wayne as captain. So I tried to do everything. I was thrust into more of an offensive role, trying to fill some of Wayne's huge shoes. I played more minutes than normal on penalty kills and power plays. I tried to do more defensively in our own zone. I took more face-offs, everything. I would have played goal if there'd been enough room for 2 of us in the crease. If they'd let me sell popcorn and programs, I probably would have. All that extra effort worked at first, but it wasn't sustainable. I had forgotten the lesson. No one wins alone. So, Greg, we've talked about this idea of trying too hard before, and that's exactly what he's doing here.
Perhaps we try and, certainly in a sporting environment, play a little bit beyond our own capabilities and maybe try things that we're not comfortable with, things that we're not particularly skilled at, things that we don't normally do. And that's a really honest pursuit, because you want to try and improve things as much as you can for your situation and the situation of those around you and your team. But if that comes to the detriment of the overall performance of what you're trying to achieve, it's probably not the right way to go about things. So doubling down on the things that you're really good at, just putting an effort into the small, simple things that got you to the position that you were in, that's usually a better way of going about things than trying to force the issue.
Of course, he does force the issue, and they end up losing 4-3 to Gretzky and the Kings. And it's a really nice reflection. He has a great way of saying this. And he said, if we had done all the right things and still lost, it would have been easier to swallow. Maybe they would have beaten us anyway. I don't know. But the way we ended up losing was tough because I tried to do everything myself. My teammates weren't being relied upon. They weren't invested in their roles because I didn't have enough trust in the process with the entire team. That's the wrong message to send. You've got to give people an opportunity to do their jobs. In that series against Los Angeles, my ego got in the way. That was our iceberg. The summer did for me what it always had, afforded me an opportunity to reset, recharge, and take my mind to another place. This time, though, around all the fun in LA, there were some dark times of reflection. It was the first time in my NHL career that I had been in a formal position to lead, and I had lived with that responsibility every day and night. People were looking up to me, and I got carried away with something unrelated to what was happening on the ice. We'd had all this success because we'd built an understanding that everyone has to do their part. Everyone has to pull on the same oar, I always like to say. But I had turned my back on what I knew to be the formula for success, and I tried to row the boat myself. The loss was on me, and there was no running from that. It was painful to accept, but the summer helped me own it. Greg, I love the idea that the road to success is paved with mistakes well handled, and he's made a really big mistake here, but he seems to be committed to learning from it.
I think a lot of people will think well handled in the moment, and that would be ideal because you can course correct immediately. But learning after the fact is also handling mistakes as well. And I think that if you can handle those mistakes, learn from them, redirect your behaviors, long-term success is what comes as a product of that.
So after the disappointment of losing to Gretzky and the LA Kings, the following season, the Oilers bounced back and they beat the Bruins in the Stanley Cup final in 1990, 4-1. And he says, I've heard some people say that this cup, our fifth in 7 years, was our best because we did it without Wayne. I don't look at it that way. There was a part of me that was still a little sad because he wasn't there to share it with us. He was a brother, and that would never change. I think more than anything, the cup was an affirmation of the incredible grit and determination of the players who had surrounded Wayne all those years. So it's really an affirmation that they weren't this one team player and managed to win 5 in 7 seasons, which is pretty incredible. And then just as we talked about Gretzky's trade, Messier gets traded in 91 and he says, I arrived in New York pretty confident. I'd come off 5 cups in 7 years, 6 finals in 8. At 30, I was still playing at a very high level and I thought I could instill a winning culture. So to come in and try to do something that hadn't been done in half a century was more appealing to me than it was daunting. I looked at it as an opportunity. And it wasn't like the Rangers team I was joining was a mess. The concepts I had learned were certainly still useful. The words weren't. The only way to make use of my experience was by example, to walk the walk and hope that my new teammates would fall into stride with me. I'm so thankful I was able to catch myself at that moment because to start talking about the past would have been a massive mistake. I needed to put all my focus into this team. So, Greg, with all of Mark Messier's experience and success, it would have been really easy for him to walk into the New York Rangers and say, hey, this is how we did it in Edmonton. Let's follow this recipe. But instead, he says, I'm not going to do it in my words. I'm going to do it in my actions.
If I put myself in the position of a Rangers player here, I think probably the last thing that I'd want was for someone to come in and be, oh, this is how we did it when we were successful over here. But I think you can quietly provide that example by your experience and by the actions and the behaviors. And I think the more that you do those behaviors and show that those are the ways that you get those successes, You don't necessarily need those words. Thinking back to when they walked past the dressing room and saw the guys that were just beaten and bloodied after 4 Stanley Cups on the bounce and covered in ice packs, I don't think that would have resonated as much if they were just having the conversation and saying, oh yeah, we were all battered and we had ice packs on. But actually seeing that and seeing the example and what it takes to win, what it takes to be successful, is a far more resonant moment for me.
It was true, we had talent. We also had issues. There's a huge delta between championship teams, or teams that are on cusp of a championship, and those that are a work in progress. Championship teams need to have the obvious components: talented players, depth, a great coach, a dynamic offense, a solid defense, and superb goaltending. These are easy to recognize. But championship teams also need to have the intangibles: chemistry, character, determination, leadership, and experience. Recognizing the intangibles that you're missing and finding a way to implement them is the hardest part of building a winning team. He's really talking here, Greg, about finding a winning formula. You have to find the right ingredients in the right combination if you're going to learn how to win.
And once you find that combination, winning also comes with its own sets of issues. Once you find that formula, it has to be constantly tweaked, tested, and proven to maintain it. And that is something that is a bit of an infinite game. You have to continue to do that over a really long period of time for sustained success.
If winning or excellence is important to you, you have to be willing to be criticized for the choices you make, if you believe they are right. Leadership in its most difficult moments is about conviction, and winning was more important to me than popularity. I knew better, and honestly, I think that's one of the reasons I was brought in, to provide that kind of guidance. The Rangers hadn't won in half a century, and they didn't have anybody who really understood what a championship culture was about. So if I wasn't willing to take a risk and change things, who would? There's a backlash when you take a stand, but if you're uncomfortable with that, you shouldn't be in a leadership position. So, Greg, leadership is lonely at times, and sometimes you can actually be very unpopular.
That's the unfortunate nature of the position, is that you can please some of the people some of the time, but not all of the people all of the time. And when you're experiencing great success, leadership is easy and people are on board. But when you're going through some rocky patches or trying to make some change or trying to maybe persuade people that there is another way to do this, leadership certainly is very lonely and can in fact be very, very unpopular. And that's perhaps the hardest challenge of any leader.
And I love this next section because it aligns with so much that we've said in previous episodes. He said, the mistake many people make is not understanding that success is a lifestyle. Nobody was a better example of this during the 93-94 season than our goalie, Mike Richter. He was a maniac about preparation. He used to say, preparation isn't like a jersey you put on. It's more like your skin. You can't take it off. It was the way he trained, the way he ate, even the way he thought, everything. He was constantly in search of exactly the right formula to produce optimal results. He kept a log of his sleeping habits, charting how many hours he slept and when. He kept track of whether his sleep was uninterrupted and then cross-referenced it to his performance the next day. These days, that is hardly uncommon in professional sports, but 25 years ago, it bordered on radical. So, Greg, the imitating majority follow the innovating minority. These things are now commonplace in high performance domains, but 25, 30 years ago, it wasn't like that.
He does say, in fact, it bordered on radical, and for me, this maybe borders on obsessive. But it goes back to our earlier discussion, as you quite rightly say, if you get the big stuff right, then you can focus on the little things. And I'll go back and repeat my big four there. We've got getting your mind, which he mentions, getting your sleep, which he mentions, getting your nutrition, which he mentions, and getting your recovery and your training balance correct. And I really love that line. I'm going to read it again. Preparation isn't like a jersey you put on. It's more like your skin. You can't take it off. I really, really like that.
A leader's job is actually very simple. Make those around you better. I never graduated high school, but I love to read, in part because it transports me to beautiful places, but also because I often discover new ideas that I can apply to my life and work. Every year at Christmas, I would give my teammates a book, something I hoped that would help them unlock something in themselves. One year, it was Pat Riley's The Winner Within. Another year, it was Phil Jackson's Sacred Hoops, a book that really speaks to me in how it lays out the importance of sacrificing the me for the we in winning cultures. Greg, Messier is literally telling us to tap into the collective wisdom of those who came before us. This is obviously the essence of this podcast, to learn from the best who have ever done it and apply those lessons. And he's doing this. He's giving actual books to his teammates.
This sounds like something pretty consistent with a few of the people that we've talked about in previous episodes. Why not? Why not learn from other people that have been there before you? This is what he did with his family, learning from his dad, Doug, and from his brother, Paul. It's what he's done with Wayne Gretzky. He's learned from him. He's learned from his teammates around him. And why not leverage the things that other people are doing and have done to maximize your performance? And to remind you, this is Performers, the podcast that takes you inside the minds of the best who have done it.
So it takes them a few seasons, but in 1994, the Rangers are on course for the Stanley Cup. They're in the semifinals. They're against the Devils, but they're down 3-2. There must have been 30 people there, and I told them what I believed. We're going to go in there and win Game 6, I told them. We know we're going to win Game 6 and bring it back for Game 7. Consider the context, though. The best team in hockey, after half a century of misery, stands on the brink of underachievement yet again, only to have their captain guarantee a win. There are two ways this could have played out. It could have ratcheted up the pressure on my teammates and worked against us, or it could have told them I was supremely confident in who we were, how we prepared, and what we were about, and gotten us back on track. What about this guarantee, Greg? Is this a smart move to take the pressure off your teammates? I mean, he's been there and he's won it 5 times, and some of his teammates haven't.
I don't know if it takes the pressure off his teammates by saying I'm guaranteeing we're going to win. I don't know how I feel about this. If it comes off, it's a masterstroke. If it doesn't come off, you look like an idiot. So I think if you're willing to sort of place that bet and back yourself, I would suggest that that's a really good sign of confidence, perhaps, and belief in his team around him. But yeah, no one knows better what it takes to be successful. He's been there and won it 5 times. So why not back yourself?
The next morning, the guarantee was all anyone was talking about on the radio. At a time like this, the difference between winning or losing comes down to the smallest things. We had a lot of guys on the team who had won. We also had a lot who hadn't. This is where experience is crucial. Every team on its way to a championship has to face this moment at some point, where you look around and decide collectively, have we had enough this year, or are we going to push harder? Veteran guys help everyone find more to give and get them through the moment, because we've done it before. If some people thought saying what I did was a risk, so be it. There's always one more thing that can be done, and everyone wants to be great, Greg, until they find out what it takes. And he's saying that they're facing this moment here, and the veterans just need to push those rookies a little bit more. Well, he guaranteed to win, and he scores a hat-trick, and they win 4-2. They take it back to New York, and they win the conference finals 4-3. So in the finals, they again face a Game 7, but this time it's against the Canucks. And he says, we got on the plane that night, every one of us knowing that when we played our next game at home, the cup would be in the house. That was invigorating. It was also a challenge. The reason the cup was there, as each and every one of us knew and understood, was because this was the potential series-clinching game, and those are the toughest to win. It's human nature to get ahead of yourself. The players can't ignore it, but it's crucial to make sure that energy is going in the right direction. At this point in the season, 100% focus is required. Against a team like the Canucks, up against the ropes, desperate and likely to play with abandonment, nothing less would do. The series should never have gotten to a Game 7, but it didn't matter how it happened. All that mattered to us was for us to regroup and get back to doing what we'd done all year. When we got back to New York was manic. Between the possibilities of winning or losing, fans were hyperventilating. Greg, what advice do you have for any listeners in terms of just staying focused and a huge amount of pressure?
So here's a 4-step approach for you to get the best out of your focus during your performance. First one is set some specific intentions. What are you actually trying to achieve during this performance. If you can be specific as possible, that's always going to stand you in great stead. Number 2, identify your attentional thieves. What are the things that tend to distract you? You're going to know what these things are. They're going to be pretty commonplace. Make a note of them, identify them, have an understanding how they impact you. Number 3, develop cues to help you redirect your focus when one of your attentional thieves comes and distracts you. Number 4, rinse and repeat. You're going to have to do this over and over and over again. No one stays focused for a really long period of time. What they do is they focus for a couple of moments, they get distracted. The key is to be able to bring that focus back and redirect it to where you need to be. That's where the rinse and repeat becomes so important.
I love those 4 steps. So, how are they going to apply it? They're going in Game 7, Stanley Cup Finals in New York. I've heard people say that you shouldn't get too high when you win or too low when you lose. I couldn't disagree more. I always wanted my teammates to feel the emotion. You should feel elation when you achieve, and you should feel the pain when you lose something important. You should use those feelings as benchmarks, something to shoot for or avoid. Use your emotions to fuel you. There may be some athletes out there who play only for their teammates or even just for themselves, but I can tell you this, we knew what it meant to this franchise and its fans. We felt at a deep level how important this moment was for everyone who cared about the Rangers in the city. That emotion drove us even more to do something special. The energy it would take to block out something that powerful would itself be a distraction. It would be pointless. You are better served to embrace that energy and use it. It was no time for the faint of heart. With the building shaking above us, with 54 years of frustration and angst, I reminded myself and the team that all year long we had been the best in the league. Greg, any reflections here on using emotion?
1 or 2, have a really clear understanding of what works for you. Now, some people have the skill set to be able to handle the emotional ups and downs. This certainly being an emotional up. But some people don't and would benefit from a more sustained or a more consistent emotional level. Some people love a roller coaster, the emotional highs, the emotional lows, but some people actually prefer a pretty boring, slow golf cart ride where that emotion is consistent and they know what they're coming into. So I would say avoid painting people all with the same brush. Recognize those individual differences that he talked about very, very early on today. And know that some people are going to love the emotions, some people are going to have a hard time handling them, but respect the individual.
So, going to the game, he says, we controlled the play and the seconds ticked by, and all of a sudden, it was over. 4-3 victor in the final game and clinched the series 4-3. There was a sign in the crowd made by a fan that through the years has come to symbolize the meaning of that accomplishment. Now I can die in peace. So he really cements himself as a legend in New York sports history. He ends up playing 3 more seasons with the Rangers until things kind of sour over contracts, and eventually he's traded to the Vancouver Canucks. And this is what kind of New York meant to him, and I think this is the human side of pro sports, Greg. He says, it tore my heart out to leave, but I felt like I had no other option. We shook hands on a deal in Vancouver, and I collapsed in tears right then and there. It was suddenly overwhelming, the sadness of all I'd left behind and the promise of what lay ahead. I was viewed as a missing piece of the puzzle that could help get them to the ultimate success. I wanted that too, of course, and when I joined the team, I did so with the hope and belief that it was within reach. For a variety of reasons, it didn't work out in Vancouver, and he left after 3 seasons and was traded back to the Rangers. But of course, he's older now. His career's coming to an end, and it just doesn't quite work out, and he has to face the reality of retirement. And he says, every team I played on was special to me. The personal relationships, the sense of adventure and the unknown, even the disappointments. Together, they added up to something bigger. It was all about the human connection through the game. Professional sport is defined by winning and losing, but you're missing out if you're only concentrating on the end result instead of the journey. And the irony is that if you're paying attention to the quality and depth of experience, it will lead you right back to the thing you were seeking in the first place, success. I played 26 years but won the cup only 6 times. Does that mean the other 20 seasons should be considered a loss? Absolutely not. I felt I was able to take something positive away from every losing season, that each one could be harnessed and learned from to create a winning culture in the future. My hope is I've been able to convey how powerful it is to be part of something bigger than yourself, and how much gratitude I found in the collective experiences with my family and my teams, which is the most important lesson of all. Maybe you can accomplish good things alone, but if you open your heart, you've got a better chance of accomplishing great things together. The Rangers held a ceremony to retire my number 11, raising a banner to the rafters in Madison Square Garden. Their thoughtfulness in making sure every aspect of the evening was perfect was just another reminder of what I felt most of all about my life in hockey: gratitude. I have never wanted to be the center of attention, but on the greatest stage in the greatest city, this was now my curtain call. As I said to my teammates many times over the years, there's no place to hide out there, so let's go. As I looked around and saw all of them, never was it more clear to me: no one wins alone. And that is where we'll leave it today. Greg, as we like to say on Performers, success leaves clues. So, what are your top 10 life lessons from No One Wins Alone by Mark Messier?
A lot of great stuff here, so let's break it down. Number 1, value hard work over talent. Emphasize relentless hard work and dedication as the foundations for success, regardless of your natural talent. Messier says winning isn't an accident, it is a strategy, and you get out of it what you put in. Number 2, foster a team-first mentality. Build a culture where the team's success is prioritized over individual achievements. He says, I always felt like the most important job I had was to make whatever organization I was part of successful. Number 3, embrace diversity and inclusion. Encourage a team environment where different personalities and perspectives are valued and contribute to success. He said, our dressing room was one that prided itself on diversity. Letting people be themselves was a big part of the dynamic we were building. Number 4, lead by example. Demonstrate commitment and work ethic through your actions, inspiring others to follow you. What a great leader does is get the best out of the people he or she leads. Number 5, stay resilient in the face of adversity. Learn from setbacks and use them as stepping stones to greater achievements. He says, I wasn't satisfied with the result, but I could see how the season had been a crucial learning experience for all of us. Number 6, cultivate a strong work ethic. Model and demand a high level of dedication and effort from yourself and from others. Success is a lifestyle. Preparation isn't like a jersey you put on, it's more like your skin. You can't take it off. Number 7, inspire through a shared vision. Motivate your team by creating and communicating a compelling vision of success. The leader then has to convince people we can do this and help them understand this is how we're going to do it. Number 8, value the journey over the destination. Focus on the quality and depth of experiences rather than just the end results. Professional sport is defined by winning and losing, but you're missing out if you're only concentrating on the end result instead of the journey. Number 9, embrace change and adaptability. Be open to new experiences and flexible in your approach to challenges. I was pretty open-minded from my travels each summer. Mostly, I'd become increasingly interested in Eastern philosophy. And finally, number 10, maintain a balance between confidence and humility. Balance self-assurance with a willingness to learn and grow. Messier says, ego can be a good thing when it fuels your confidence. It can also be a terrible thing if it makes you deluded.
Another fantastic top 10. As always, we can also learn from people's stories by identifying the behaviors to avoid on our own path to mastery. So what are your top 10 lessons to avoid from Mark Messier's story?
Number 1, avoid over-reliance on a single strategy. Don't depend solely on one approach. Adapt and diversify your strategies. Number 2, don't ignore team dynamics. Pay attention to how team dynamics affect overall performance and address issues promptly. Messier says about his time in Vancouver, a team squared off in cliques. It was new to me. I knew problems like this existed on some teams, but I'd never really seen it before. Number 3, avoid neglecting mental and emotional preparation. Recognize the importance of mental and emotional readiness alongside your physical preparation. He says, I was electrified with an appreciation for how vast the mind is and that there's so much we don't know. Number 4, don't overlook the need for rest and recovery. You have to balance your intense effort with sufficient rest to avoid burnout and maintain your peak performance. He said of his breaks, without these restorative getaways, weeks on end with no schedule, I would never have been able to play 26 years in the league. Number 5, avoid isolating yourself from your team. Stay engaged and connected with your team members to maintain unity and morale. He said, on our flights, guys put on their headphones, watched movies, and went to sleep. It was just dead from an energy and bonding perspective. Number 6, don't underestimate the power of team culture. Maintain and nurture a strong team culture to ensure long-term success. He says, the culture, if it's strong, remains intact. One of the reasons you see teams lose year after year is that they keep bringing in new coaches with new ideas, philosophies, or systems. Number 7, avoid allowing ego to drive decisions. Keep ego in check and focus on the collective good rather than individual accolades. Messier says, in that series against Los Angeles, my ego got in the way. That was our iceberg. Number 8, don't ignore the importance of leadership transition. Facilitate smooth leadership transitions to maintain stability and continuity. Talking about Lee Fogelin, his captain, he says Lee embodied the selfless nature that's required all the way down the roster. A person can have great pride, but not ego. Number 9, avoid making decisions without team input. Involve team members in decision-making processes to ensure buy-in and cooperation. He says ultimately though, you can never fix a problem without the participation of the people who are living it. And finally, number 10, don't disregard the emotional impact of leadership. Be mindful of the emotional toll leadership can take and manage it effectively. Speaking of leadership, he says, I was tired, not physically but emotionally. Professional hockey is a 24/7, 11-month journey with no let up. Thank you so much for joining myself and Duncan on this episode. If you enjoyed what you heard, please take a moment to click like and to subscribe. And we ask that you take a moment out of your day to spread the word by sharing this with 2 people in your network. And for that, we are truly grateful. See you next time on Performers.